Fiscal policy. Terminology used: aggregate supply and demand. Aggregate demand: the total demand from households, businesses, governments, and foreign buyers. Aggregate supply: the total amount of all goods and services produced by an economy at a given price level. The ADAS model: quantity supplied: the total amount of a particular good or service that sellers are able and willing to produce at a given price level. Aggregate supply: the total amount of all goods, services produced by an economy at a given price level. Terminology used: government spending. As we discussed in the GDP lesson, government spending is spending by the government on goods and services. This is increased in order to stimulate economic expansion and decreased in order to cause economic contraction. This includes all of the wages and benefits paid to government workers, since the government purchases their services. Terminology used: taxation. Many governments use taxation to collect money. This money is used for government spending. Taxes are usually collected from individuals or businesses. Income tax: a tax on individual earnings, usually increased with increasing earnings, but within certain income brackets. Sales tax: a tax on purchases made by individuals. Now, related to that, you have a value-added tax, or VAT. This is very much the same type of tax, but it's just termed a slightly different way. Taxes on corporate profits. These taxes are levied on businesses, profits, and they vary greatly among countries. Deficits and surpluses in the government budget. Budget deficit is the situation in which the government's expenditures are greater than its tax revenue. Budget surplus is the situation in which the government's expenditures are less than its tax revenue. Fiscal policy is the use of government spending and taxation or revenue collection to influence the economy. This is necessary because all economies go through cycles of booms and busts. The goal of fiscal policy are usually to try to achieve high employment, price stability, economic growth, and improvement of the international payments balance. In other words, the difference between exports and imports. Bahrain's balance of trade, which is the difference between its exports and its imports. What do you notice about Bahrain's balance of trade? And in the graph, we can see the balance of trade between 2006 until 2016. And 2016 is the first year showing a negative balance of trade, which means that the amount of the imports exceeds the amount of the exports for the year 2016. In prior years, the amount of the exports exceeded the amount of imports, measured in Bahraini dinar. This is measured in millions of Bahraini dinar. Business cycles. This graph illustrates a concept known as the business cycle. You have periods of time in which the GDP of the economy expands, that means grows, and periods of time in which it contracts, that means shrinks and becomes less. And these cycles are often known as boom and bust. Boom during an expansion and bust during a contraction. Types of fiscal policy. Expansionary policy is financial policy that encourages economic growth. It's used to prevent a recession or a contraction in the level of GDP. Higher spending by the government and tax cuts can be used for an expansionary fiscal policy. The government buys more goods and services to create jobs. A contractionary fiscal policy is the opposite. It is a fiscal policy that reduces economic growth. It is achieved through lower government spending and higher taxes. The government buys less goods to slow GDP growth. Expansionary fiscal policy. During a contraction or recession, the government can do two things to try to increase the country's aggregate demand. It can decrease taxes or it can increase spending, and it sometimes can do a combination of those two. Reducing taxes increases private demand for goods and services. More demand leads to more production. More production leads to more jobs. And more jobs leads to more demand. So we're seeing a virtuous cycle here. Okay? A virtuous cycle which should lead to an expansion in the gross domestic product. Increased government spending increases the demand for goods. More demand leads to more production leads to more jobs, and more jobs in turn leads to more demand. So again, it causes a virtuous cycle which should increase the aggregate demand and increase the GDP. Bahrain's fiscal situation. Discuss in groups Bahrain's fiscal situation. And you have a number of graphs given below. These graphs continue the cycle we saw before, from 2006 forward to 2014. And it's showing Bahrain's government revenues and Bahrain's fiscal expenditure. Okay? Please discuss these graphs. What do you notice about the pattern here? There might be something you notice about fiscal expenditure between 2008 and 2014. Exercise. Discuss the difference between Bahrain's nominal and real GDP. So this is Bahrain's GDP at constant prices, given here. Down below is, the constant prices is the GDP value given below. We can see a nice increasing pattern here. The nominal GDP is given here, and this is given in US dollar billions. This one is in Bahraini dinar millions. Okay. Remember that the constant prices is an adjusted value. And what do you notice about the difference between the nominal and the real GDP? Exercise. Bahrain's GDP per capita. What was the percentage change in nominal GDP per capita between 2006 and 2011? Why does this graph visually overstate this difference? Aside from a change in GDP, what else could cause a fall in the GDP per capita number? Aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and long-run aggregate supply, sometimes called LRAS. AD, or aggregate demand, represents the total demand for all goods and services produced within a country at a given price level. AS, or aggregate supply, represents the total supply for all goods and services produced within a country at a given price level. The LRAS, or long-run aggregate supply, represents the natural level of output GDP in conditions of full employment. Remember from the unemployment section what we meant by full employment. It is impossible to permanently increase output beyond this level, but it is possible to temporarily increase output through payments of overtime, etc. The AD-AS-LRAS graph B represents the real GDP and the price level across the whole economy when there is full employment. Exercise: expansionary fiscal policy. Use the AD-AS-LRAS curves. Draw a graph showing what would happen to real GDP and the price level if the government increased its spending. Answers: inflationary gap. A temporary inflationary gap would occur. This is not sustainable because it requires overemployment, people working overtime to meet demand. If this continued for too long, it would increase the price of labor, which would negatively affect the AS curve. Exercise on AD, AS, LRAS. Use the AD, AS, LRAS curves to show what would happen to real GDP and the price level if the government increased taxes on citizens, but saved their increased revenue rather than spending it. Answer: a temporary recessionary gap would be created. This is not sustainable because there is unemployment. Eventually, unemployment will reduce wages, which will cause a rightward shift in the AS curve to take advantage of the cheaper labor and bring us back to full employment on the LRAS. Business cycle at equilibrium. This is how the AD-AS LRAS looks when the business cycle is at equilibrium. There is full employment. Equilibrium is on the LRAS. Exercise: boom business cycle. An economic boom has created increased demand for all goods. The economy is now overproducing. Employers are working overtime, and machines are working beyond their recommended service hours. This will eventually increase the cost of labor and production and cause a negative shift in AS, such the economy returns back to full employment. Draw this last stage. Answer: here the increased cost of workers has reduced AS back to the sustainable level of full employment, LRAS, however at a higher price level than before. This is a partial explanation of how prices continually increase. Exercise: on the AD-AS LRAS, draw the first stage of what happens if there is a fall in aggregate demand due to a recession, or a reduction in government spending, or an increase in government taxation. Answer: there is a fall in both the price level and real GDP. Also, because equilibrium has shifted left of the LRAS, there is unemployment. If salaries are flexible, eventually the unemployed will become desperate for work for a reduced salary. Draw the effects of this cheaper labor on your AD-AS LRAS curves. The reduced cost of labor will increase the AS of goods and services within the economy, causing a rightward shift in the AS curve back to full employment on the LRAS. This leaves the economy producing the same level of output, real GDP, but at a lower price level than previously. Contractionary fiscal policy. During a period of excessive inflation, during a period of expansion, the government can do two things to try to reduce aggregate demand. They can increase taxes or decrease spending. Increased taxes causes people to have less money to spend. Less money causes less demand. Less demand causes lower inflation. Decrease in government spending means that there is less money in the economy. Less money leads to less demand. Less demand causes lower inflation. Exercise. 1. Fiscal policy is, now you have a number of choices here. Choice A, the government's use of taxing and spending to keep the economy stable. B, the government's use of taxing and spending to make the economy unstable. C, a plan by the government to spend its revenues. D, a plan by the government on how to control the money supply. So you have to pick which one of those options you think is correct. Question 2. Two types of expansionary policies are A, raising taxes and increasing government spending. B, raising taxes and decreasing government spending. C, cutting taxes and decreasing government spending. And D, cutting taxes and increasing government spending. And you have to choose which one of those answers is the correct answer. Limits of fiscal policy. It is hard for the government to change spending levels. Spending comes from disposable or discretionary income. It is hard to predict the future. Sometimes government action is too late, so they may wait until they know more information. The delayed time means that changes don't happen overnight. Budget planning can take a year and a half, and the economy may be moving in a different direction by the time this planning comes to fruition. Fiscal policy in practice. Coping with time lags. Recognition time lag. The time required to gather information about the current state of the economy. Okay? So often economic indicators like GDP are called lagging because they happen, the information occurs late. The alternative is to look at what's called leading economic indicators. These are indicators that occur sometimes before a contraction in the economy. Action lag time. The time required between recognizing the economic problem and putting policy into effect. That's the time taken. The effect lag time. The time taken for fiscal policy to affect the economy. So each of these can be a limitation because each of these cause time lags, time delays. Fiscal policy time lags are long, and a policy designed to correct a recession may not produce results until the economy is experiencing inflation. Fiscal policy time lags are variable in length, 1 to 3 years, and the timing of the desired effects cannot be predicted. Because fiscal policy time lags tend to be variable, policymakers have a difficult time when it comes to adjusting the economy. Bahrain's unemployment rate. In your project groups, so just discuss with some of your classmates either online or during the class time, discuss Bahrain's unemployment rate. Is it a problem or not? So we can see the employment rate here is 4.1%. And these are rankings out of 208 countries or territories. Exercise. Bahrain's inflation rate. Discuss. Bahrain's inflation rate, is it a problem or not? Why? So you can see Bahrain's inflation rate here is listed at 3.5%. And you have a time series here going back to 2010, from 2010 to 2016. Exercise, Bahrain's economic forecast. Discuss this economic forecast by the EDB. Okay, Bahrain's economic outlook. And again, this is dating back to 2015. The figures here are forecasted for 2016, 2017, and 2018. So you might be in a position to determine were these forecasts accurate or not. GCC export composition. The price of oil has fallen dramatically, and again we're looking at that same situation at the moment. Which GCC economies have been able to diversify away from this exporting commodity? Okay, and so you can look at which economies in the GCC have a high dependence on oil goods. Okay, you can see one or two are over 80%. Some of them are reducing, but in some cases you actually have an increasing dependency on oil goods. GCC tax levels. In groups, discuss the amount of government revenues generated from taxes in the GCC. And again, this data is going back to 2015, so please discuss that. Value added tax, or VAT. Below is a selection of countries which use a VAT. A VAT is a tax on goods sold within a country. So it's very similar to what we called a sales tax earlier. If the VAT is 15% and a coffee costs 1 BD, the coffee seller will sell it for 1.15 BD, with 150 fills of the final sales price going to the government. So have a look at the different VAT rates in different countries. Expat workers' remittances. A large amount of money is sent out of GCC countries by expat workers living in those countries. There have been proposals to tax these payments. Discuss in your groups. Bahrain's demographics, gender and age. Look at the graph below and discuss Bahrain's demographic situation. What caused it and what consequences there may be for fiscal policy? So we can see the largest demographic is this 20 to 29-year-old male population.